T is the summer of 1942 on a golf course on the Isles of Scilly, and a man in tweed is standing on the highest point of the fairway with a peregrine falcon perched on his gauntlet, scanning the horizon for German spies. He is not imagining things, or not entirely. 2 months earlier, a fishing vessel off the coast of Ipswich pulled in a pair of pigeons that had no business being there. One carried a message written in German. The other had Wehrmacht stamped into its wing rings. Somewhere out across the channel, it seemed, the enemy had birds of their own, flying north with whatever they could see written into a few grams of rolled paper hidden in a lead canister. For an island nation that had spent 2 years training hundreds of thousands of homing pigeons to fly the other way, carrying resistance intelligence out of occupied Europe, the thought of the traffic running in reverse was intolerable. So Britain did something about it. It recruited the fastest animal on Earth, trained it for 5 weeks on a Pembrokeshire airfield, and sent it to the most remote scrap of English coastline available, with orders to find and kill enemy carrier pigeons before they could reach the continent. What followed was one of the strangest sub-departments ever to operate under the authority of MY5. A real falconry unit, with real government funding, real classified intelligence reports, and a real license to kill, built to fight a threat that may never have existed in the first place. By the time the operation wound down, it would leave behind a paper trail of admirably straight-faced bureaucratic prose, a body count made up entirely of British pigeons, and one of the more honest lessons of the entire war, that fear, even reasonable fear, does not need to be correct in order to consume real resources, real training, and real lives. This is the story of the unit raised to stop a spy network that was almost certainly imaginary, and the surprisingly serious lengths Britain went to in order to find out. By 1940, the pigeon had become unexpectedly central to the British war effort. Roughly 200,000 birds had been donated to the National Pigeon Service by ordinary breeders, fanciers, and racing clubs across the country, and they were doing work that radios could not. A pigeon needs no battery, sends no signal that can be triangulated by a German direction-finding unit, and cannot be tortured into giving up a frequency. As the conflict intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant Richard Walker liked to put it to anyone who would listen, a pigeon cannot talk. For agents and resistance cells scattered across occupied France, Belgium, and Holland, a bird dropped by parachute with a questionnaire attached was sometimes the only safe way to get information back to London at all. The wider effort, run by the deliberately unglamorous-sounding MI-14D and known as Operation Columba, would eventually see tens of thousands of these birds dropped into enemy territory, asking ordinary farmers and resistance sympathizers to report troop movements, coastal defenses, and the locations of new German installations. But intelligence work runs in both directions, and Britain's own paranoia about infiltration was running at a fever pitch. The threat of German agents landing by submarine or parachute, blending into rural communities and quietly relaying what they saw back to Berlin, was treated with total seriousness throughout 1940 and 1941. And there was a reason to suspect pigeons specifically. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Gestapo, was by his own colleagues' account an obsessive pigeon fancier, and intelligence reports reaching London suggested he had folded his hobby directly into his organization, with the German National Pigeon Society effectively absorbed into the machinery of the Gestapo. If the man running Nazi Germany's secret police loved pigeons enough to put them under his own department's control, the reasoning went, it was not paranoid to assume he intended to use them. The sightings that followed seemed to confirm it. In 1941, observers on the Isles of Scilly reported pigeons flying south, out over open water toward the French coast, departing from no loft that British forces could account for. The following year brought the discovery off Ipswich, a vessel hauling in 2 birds, one bearing a coded German message, the other stamped with German military markings. A further bird, marked Wehrmacht, was reported coming aboard a motor launch off Lowestoft. None of this constituted proof of an organized network, but to the men responsible for Britain's internal security in the middle of a war that was, at that point, going extremely badly, it did not need to be proof. It needed only to be plausible. The trouble was that nobody in British intelligence had ever had to find, identify, and stop an airborne spy traveling at 60 miles an hour with no fixed flight path and no distinguishing features visible from the ground. There was no existing doctrine for this. Wireless transmissions could be detected and located. Agents on the ground could be watched, followed, and turned. A pigeon, once released from a German hand into the open sky, was simply gone. A gray blur indistinguishable to the naked eye from the hundreds of thousands of entirely innocent British birds doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same airspace, at exactly the same time, for exactly the opposite purpose. Shooting every pigeon flying toward the continent was not an option. It would have meant gunning down Britain's own intelligence-gathering network along with whatever the Germans were or were not sending the other way. The answer the MI5 settled on was strange, even by the standards of a department that spent the war full of strange answers. If you cannot tell a friendly pigeon from a hostile one with human eyes, find an animal that can hunt by instinct. Train it to do the job a man with a shotgun could not, and let nature do the discrimination work intelligence officers were unable to manage on their own. The Director General of MI5 approved the creation of a dedicated falconry unit, recognizing that the peregrine falcon, already notorious among pigeon fanciers for the damage wild birds were doing to returning racing and military pigeons along the coast, might be turned from a problem into a solution. The logic had a certain elegance. A peregrine in a dive, known as a stoop, can reach speeds estimated at well over 200 miles an hour, faster than almost any powered aircraft of the era over a short distance, and faster by a wide margin than anything a pigeon, however well trained, could outmaneuver. If you wanted something capable of running down a bird in open sky with no radar, no radio, and no warning, a peregrine falcon was, on paper, close to the perfect weapon. The men assembled to run this small, strange department were trained at a base in Pembrokeshire, on the western edge of Wales, working with falcons over a period of roughly 5 weeks before deployment. Falconry itself was and remains a slow and exacting craft, built on patience rather than force. A bird is not commanded so much as persuaded, through careful handling and the controlled use of hunger, to treat its handler's gauntlet as the safest and most rewarding place in its world. A peregrine is not trained the way a dog might be trained, through repeated obedience drills, but through a far more delicate negotiation. The falconer manages the bird's weight almost to the gram, keeping it sharp enough to want to fly and hunt, but never so hungry that it loses condition or so well fed that it has no reason to return. The team had to take this centuries-old discipline, normally used for hunting game such as grouse or partridge on country estates, and repurpose it entirely for state security, training their birds to fly reconnaissance patterns over open water and to react to any pigeon-shaped silhouette crossing their patch of sky. The birds themselves were not bred for the role from scratch. Peregrine falcons taken from existing wild populations along the British coast. The same birds already notorious for harassing returning service pigeons were trapped, calmed, and brought under the falconer's control, using methods that had barely changed since medieval times. A leather hood to keep the bird calm and disoriented when not flying, jesses, thin leather straps fastened to the legs to keep it tethered safely to the gauntlet, and a creance, a long training line, used to build the bird's confidence in returning to the handler before it was ever trusted to fly free. Only once a falcon would reliably return to the fist for reward, time after time, at increasing distance, was it considered ready for operational flying. Compressed into 5 weeks, this was an ambitious schedule for a craft that traditionally took falconers years to master with a single bird, and it speaks to how seriously the threat was being treated that the Air Ministry and MI5 were willing to compress it so drastically. Once trained, the unit was sent to the place considered most likely to intercept whatever traffic was crossing the channel. The Isles of Scilly, a granite scattering of islands roughly 45 kilometers off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, closer to occupied France than almost anywhere else in Britain. The operational base, by all accounts, was the island's golf course, which offered clear sight lines out across the water in several directions at once. One man would take the highest point of the course. Another would cross to a vantage point near the coast. Each stood with a trained peregrine on the wrist, watching the sky, ready to release the bird the instant a pigeon came into view heading the wrong way. A confidential 1942 assessment of the program, later declassified, described the arrangement with evident satisfaction, it noting that falcons positioned across the islands could cover not merely one part of one island, but the whole group, and that any pigeon flying over them would be attacked. On the page, in the dry language of an intelligence report, it read like a closed case. In practice, on the ground, it was a small number of men standing on a golf course in good weather, waiting for a German spy bird that may never have existed to fly into range of a British hunting bird that could not tell the difference between an enemy agent's pigeon and somebody's racing champion from Plymouth. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The unit's central, fatal weakness was one that nobody in 1942 had a workable solution for. There was no method of marking British pigeons in flight that a falcon, or for that matter a human handler at distance, could actually see and act on in time. Identification rings were fitted to birds on the ground long before they ever took to the air, and were of no use whatsoever to a falcon making a split-second decision 200 feet above the waves. To a peregrine in a stoop, a pigeon was a pigeon. National loyalty was not a category its instincts recognized, and nor, in the chaos of an actual intercept, was it one a falconer on the ground had time to apply either. The results that followed were as predictable as they were embarrassing. Pigeons returning from genuine intelligence missions across occupied Europe, birds that had survived German anti-aircraft fire, exhaustion, and exactly the kind of hawk attacks the unit had been built to prevent, were being run down by Britain's own trained falcons within sight of home. One British officer, on a commando raid along the French coast, released 2 pigeons to signal his safe arrival, only to watch hawks descend from the cliffs and kill both birds before they had traveled any meaningful distance at all, severing his only line of communication in the process. That particular incident involved wild, uncontrolled hawks rather than the trained unit itself, but it illustrated precisely the danger the official program was meant to guard against and instead, in numerous documented cases, actively contributed to. There is, to date, no verified record of the Falcon Destruction Unit or its successor falconry teams bringing down a single confirmed enemy pigeon. There is a documented instance of 2 birds being captured and treated, with a certain dry MY5 humor, as prisoners of war, the officer in charge reporting that they were now working hard at breeding English pigeons, although later historians examining the same files have expressed considerable doubt that those 2 birds were ever German agents at all. What the operation produced instead, by the consistent account of multiple post-war examinations of the files, was the death of an unknown but real number of British pigeons, killed by British falcons, in defense against a threat that the same files increasingly suggest amounted to very little. Set against this was the genuine, well-documented success running in the opposite direction. Operation Columba, the offensive use of British pigeons dropped into occupied Europe, delivered intelligence that proved demonstrably valuable, including reports that helped identify radar installations and the launch sites later used for V-1 and V-2 attacks on Britain, information that conventional reconnaissance had failed to locate. The contrast is almost too neat for a documentary script, and yet it is simply what the records show. Britain's pigeons, flying outward into danger, materially shaped the intelligence picture of the war. Britain's falcons, flying defensively at home, appear to have achieved nothing beyond the deaths of the very birds they were meant to protect. The Germans, for their part, had a parallel anti-pigeon effort of their own, deploying falcons along the coasts of Belgium, France, and the Netherlands specifically to intercept the British pigeons being dropped for Columba, and by several accounts this German effort was considerably more effective. killing meaningful numbers of British birds before they ever reached the channel on the return leg. The Americans, meanwhile, dabbled briefly in the same idea, with the Army Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth announcing plans in 1941 to train a few hundred falcons for similar interception duties, including at least one bird reportedly named Thunderbolt and fitted, according to some contemporary accounts, with sharpened metal claws. Like the British program, the American effort produced enthusiasm, press coverage, and very little in the way of results, and was quietly allowed to fade. What makes the British case distinctive is less the falconry itself, which several nations attempted in some form, than the sheer institutional seriousness with which M115 pursued it, right down to a specially constituted Falcon Destruction Unit, formed earlier in the war to clear wild, uncontrolled hawks from nesting sites along the cliffs of southern England. That unit, led by a retired colonel and made up of 5 armed men, scoured cliff tops for nests, abseiled down rock faces to set spring traps, and shot any birds they could not capture, all in the name of protecting Britain's own pigeon traffic from a natural predator problem that long predated any suspicion of German involvement. It was only once that domestic threat had been addressed that the same basic toolkit, falconers and falcons, was repurposed and pointed outward at the supposed German pigeons, with rather less to show for it. The historical verdict on the whole episode remains genuinely unsettled, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. By 1942, when the falconry unit was at its most active on Scilly, post-war analysis suggests there were no German intelligence agents still operating undetected on British soil, their networks having been comprehensively rolled up earlier in the war, in part thanks to the very code-breaking and counterintelligence successes that the Falcon program had been designed to supplement. If that assessment is correct, the unit spent a meaningful stretch of the war hunting for spy pigeons belonging to a spy network that had, in practical terms, already ceased to exist, and the handful of suspicious sightings that triggered the whole affair may simply have been misidentified British birds, blown off course, or claimed for propaganda reasons by a German side keen to suggest a more capable intelligence apparatus than it actually possessed. None of which made it a pointless story, even if it was, by most measures, an unsuccessful one. The psychological logic that produced the Falcon Destruction Unit and its falconry successor was entirely real, drawing on a genuine, well-evidenced German enthusiasm for pigeon-based intelligence work at the institutional level, filtered through wartime Britain's understandable and largely justified anxiety about infiltration. The fact that this particular countermeasure achieved little does not mean the fear that produced it was irrational by the standards of the time. It means that not every reasonable fear, pursued with real training, real funding, and real falcons, produces a workable answer. There is a broader lesson here about the nature of wartime intelligence work generally, where the great majority of resources poured into counter-espionage produce nothing visible at all, and where an organization only learns it has been chasing a phantom long after the money, the training, and in this case the birds, have already been spent. Several of the falcons used in the program, including one captured in surviving photographs from June 1945 named Ursula, are preserved today only in the photographic record held by archives such as Getty Images, caught mid-flight from a falconer's gauntlet in images that have long outlasted the operational files describing what those flights actually achieved. The broader story of Britain's wartime pigeons, by contrast, has fared rather better in public memory. Several birds that served with Operation Columba and similar offensive programs were later awarded the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, and examples of their service are preserved at museums including the Imperial War Museum in London, where the contrast between the celebrated outbound birds and the largely forgotten defensive falconry effort is, in its own quiet way, a complete summary of how the whole episode is now remembered. Picture, once more, that man on the Scilly golf course in the summer of 1942, his falcon steady on his wrist, his eyes fixed on the line where gray sea meets gray sky, waiting for an enemy that statistically may never arrive at all. He is not a fool. He is acting on intelligence reports that seemed credible at the time, in a war where the cost of disbelieving a genuine threat could be measured in captured agents and compromised networks. He simply happens to be standing at the losing end of one of the war's stranger gambles, a gambit that pitted the fastest bird on Earth against an enemy that, as far as the surviving evidence can show, was barely there. What Britain built was, in the truest sense, a weapon, trained, funded, deployed, and aimed with total institutional seriousness at a target its own Director General had personally authorized pursuing. It simply turned out to be a weapon without a target, fired for years into an empty sky, hitting, again and again, only its own side. The pigeons that mattered, the ones that altered the war, were never the ones the falcons were sent to catch. They were the ones flying the other way, out over the same stretch of water, carrying the only kind of message that no falcon, German or British, ever managed to stop.